What we're going to listen to in this section of the Trimet board meeting is John L. Bell and another guy, I forgot his name, explain Trimet's Title VI program. Title VI is 1960s legislation which prohibited racial discrimination in the use of federal funds. As we know, all of the great legislation of the 60s is now going away with our beloved, very conservative Supreme Court, who's overturning things such as Roe versus Wade and other assorted. They got rid of the Voting Rights Act, and I would imagine that the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s will also be thrown out eventually, given the state of our country at the moment. Nonetheless, Trimet still follows it supposedly. They're going to give a presentation. I'm not going to interrupt this presentation. I'm going to let John L. and his buddy there go through their steps. I question it. I mean, I don't see how anybody in their right mind can say there's any equity in anything that goes on in Portland. Never mind just Trimet, Portland city government. There is no equity here. This city and Trimet is run by white Goldschmidt gang members, okay? And it's been that way for years and years and years. All of the policies of this government revolve around yuppified, for lack of a better term, values. You know, streetcars don't serve minorities. Light rail doesn't serve minorities. We know this, okay? You don't see a bunch of minority people on the streetcar. Why not? Because it doesn't go anywhere. You see them on buses. For them to put forth the argument that they've been following Title VI, I'm sorry, I'm going to contact you, John L., and maybe you can enlighten me. But I did work there for 15 years, and I'm now been retired for 2 years, and all I see happening here is light rail coming on big time, and we know that light rail is not a minority-based transit service. It's a service that's created for developers and what's called transit-oriented development. These are all white, white sustainable green shit. It's nothing to do with minorities. This city has completely dismantled its once noble bus service in favor of this transit-oriented development, which is all Mr. White, man. Let's not mess around here with this shit. The truth is the truth. Portland is a white city, one of the whitest in America, run by white men for decades and decades. There's no black people on the city council. There's no black people in charge of Trimet. They got a couple of blacks on the Trimet board, but we all know the Trimet board is basically a sock puppet board. No matter what they try to show us in their little presentations here about how they're trying to be the people in charge, they only come for 2 hours a month. They don't know anything about Trimet. They come down once a month and they hear what the general manager tells them to listen to. Okay, they're put in specifically to help the general manager. They're not put in to ask questions of the general manager. So we know that Portland and its lily white policies are that way. There is no minority affirmative action. I mean, Trimet hires plenty of affirmative action candidates as bus drivers, and there's a few supervisors, of course. But in terms of the actual head people, no. It's Fred Hansen, it's Walsh, it's Cowan, it's McFarland. These are all people that are connected to the same people. Okay, they're all part of that, what's called that, for lack of a better term, that Goldschmidt gang. And it was Neil Goldschmidt who started all of this talk, and it turns out Neil Goldschmidt was all about Neil Goldschmidt, but he found a great religion, let's say, to hang his hat on, and was able to make fortunes on it, and from what I understand, controls huge parts of Portland political environment to this very day. So we're going to watch the presentation, but I don't believe it. I'm sorry. I think Trimet is completely abused the rights of minorities with its constant cuts to bus service and its concentration on rail. And when was the last time they added a route? Okay, they broke apart a few routes, like the 12, they turned into 93. They haven't added any bus routes. All they do is add rail now. And rail is definitely not for minorities. It's for white business people. So don't bullshit me about your Title VI crap, because I know it's not happening. I don't care what you say or how you evaluate it. I'm going to call John L. And I'm going to ask him to show me the studies that he himself, he's been here long enough, so he must have access. The studies himself has performed on, let's say, the 67 line when it was cut Sunday service, or the 59 line when it was cut to just peak hour. I want to see the studies that he says he did here, because everything over 25% cut has to be analyzed in this lens, as they say. So I'm going to ask him, and I'll call him this next week. I'm going to ask him to show me the studies related to the specific lines that were hacked to pieces. And I want to see the 17 line, which was hacked off of here. You know, a lot of this stuff, I want to see those studies. So I'll be calling you, John L.
Good piece of work. I'm glad to see this one done. Okay. All right, let's move on then to Resolution 13-11-68, which is approving the 2013 Title VI programs and policies.
Yeah, Mr. Board President, members of the board, I've asked John L. Bell to come up and actually give you a bit of a presentation on this, and the main reason, and Jake War as well, to actually indicate to you that the FTA requirements related to Title VI have changed, and they now require your endorsement and approval on a regular basis. So we have conducted this year a very thorough review of our Title VI requirements and standards, and John L. and Jake will walk through that with you.
Great. Well, good morning, members of the board, President Warner. It's a great pleasure to be here today to kind of go over the overview of Title VI. You received a number of pieces of information in your board packet. Our goal today is to kind of go over this as quickly as we can. But first, it's important to make note that there are a number of things we'll touch upon today. The first one is an overview, as I pointed out earlier, of Title VI, its application to Trimet, Title VI requirements, and how we conduct Title VI analysis and actions required of you today. There are a number of policies that we'll ask you to approve here in a second, as well as public engagement process and the service monitoring and standard process. Let's see if I can work this thing here. Okay. One of the key foundational principles of transit equity, we hear transit equity a lot here at Trimet, is the 1964 Civil Rights Act, what we also term in that act as Title VI. And the best way of really understanding this act, I think, is to just read it directly out of the legislation, which states that no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And we comply with Title VI Circular through the formal adoption of a Title VI plan and a number of key elements which we'll touch upon this morning. At the core of it, Title VI requires us to ensure that our services are provided in a non-discriminatory manner, that we proactively engage the public, especially low-income and communities of color, in our decision-making process, and that we actively, as Director Saragosa pointed out earlier, that we actively engage our LEP communities, communities who may not speak English as a first language. There have been a number of changes, as the General Manager pointed out a second ago, to this current iteration of our Title VI program requirements. Prior to 2012, when the Title VI requirements changed, FTA really essentially required us to do a couple of things, one of which was to adopt a formal complaint process. This is a process that a person can go through if they feel as if their Title VI rights have been violated. They can find it on our website. They can also find it here directly at Trimet. You see the decal on all of our facilities where it says Trimet Protects Civil Rights. This is an avenue that the public really has in order to file a complaint, if you will, if they felt as if their Title VI rights have been violated. The second was formal submission of a Title VI program, which was required and still is required of us every 3 years to FTA for a formal review and approval, and formal FTA Title VI audits to ensure agency compliance. We had a Title VI audit by FTA in 2011. As noted in 2012, FTA updated its Title VI requirements and now requires each large public transportation provider's governing board, that's a lucky job you all have, governing board to approve policies and standards in regard to major service change policy, disparate impact policy and disproportionate burden policy, system-wide service standards and system-wide service policies, and the public engagement process or public engagement plan. Additionally, the new requirement calls for agencies to conduct updated survey of passengers at least every 5 years. This is the way that we collect our demographic information, and we frankly know who's actually on our system. So the new requirement is that we conduct this analysis, but we conduct it at least every 5 years. We're certainly meeting that threshold now. And to report racial breakdown of each of our committees and to encourage the solicitation of minority participation on these committees. As noted, there are a number of actions that now require the formal adoption by the Board of Directors, specifically the adoption of a major service change, disparate impact and disproportionate burden policies, and finally the adoption of system-wide service standards. We'll talk a little bit about what that really means. Frankly, to the public as well as to you, don't blame us for the names of these things. These come directly from FTA. Imagine try explaining disparate impact to the broader public. We did our best attempt at that, and actually you'll see some pretty interesting graphics which help to try to distill these very weighty terms in more meaningful ways. It's important to note that Trimet conducts equity analyses whenever there is a proposed fare change or a major service change. Either of these changes triggers the equity analysis process, which is then brought to you before the proposed change is implemented. You'll remember a few of these over the past few years where we've conducted formal equity analyses. Oftentimes we'll make changes before it has actual impact, and if it does have an impact on either low-income or communities of color, we identify mitigations such as the mitigation fund. So what is really considered a major service change? Well, our proposed definition of major service change, and this is the operating definition that we have been moving forward with, is 25% or more in route length added or removed, 25% or more change in hours of service for the day of the week the change is made, and the addition of a new transit route. Any of these items, as I pointed out earlier, would trigger the formal equity analysis process. Integral to the equity analysis are impacts to low-income populations, which is also, oh, there we go. How about that? Integral to the equity analysis are impacts to low-income populations, or what's also termed as the disproportionate burden policy, which looks at impacts on low-income populations. Disparate impact policy looks at impacts on minority populations. And how we define that here at Trimet currently is that 150% federal poverty threshold. And essentially what that really means in terms of income per person, if you're looking at a two-person household, that's $23,265 at or below that would qualify under our definition of low income. So what we look at is a system-wide definition in terms of, within our whole service district, how many folks meet that 150% definition, and that's about 21.9% of our district population. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jake War, who is going to give you a little bit more information in detail of how all of this really plays out and really describe the terms a little bit more.
Good morning, President Warner and members of the board. As John L. said, my name is Jake War, and I'm going to walk you through the same presentation that we gave to the public in 3 community forums, and kind of describe what we currently do under Title VI, but also it's important to keep in mind that Title VI does not encompass all of our equity efforts, but it is the federally mandated part, and so this is kind of the baseline of what we do for fare and service changes. So this flow chart here gives you an overview of what we do in this process. And as John L. mentioned, anytime there's any sort of fare change or anytime there's a major service change, which has that 25% standard, we conduct an equity analysis. And what we're looking for with that equity analysis is either a disparate impact, which is the impact on minority populations, or a disproportionate burden, which is a negative impact on low-income populations. If either of those, or both, are found, then essentially we need to mitigate, change course, do something to minimize those impacts or get rid of those impacts. So a couple examples to kind of show you what a 25% threshold means for a major service change. First of all, in terms of route length, if a route were to be cut by 25%, say it was a 20-mile route and was cut by 5 miles, that would trigger this major service change and then would require an equity analysis. Similarly with frequency, if someone's bus came by every 15 minutes, so 4 an hour, and we proposed a service change that would reduce that to 3 buses an hour every 20 minutes, that 25% change would trigger this major service change, and we would do an equity analysis. And finally, in terms of hours of service, the span that service is operated, if that is cut by 25% in total, either at the end of the span or on each side of the span, just a 25% change would trigger that. So then what do we do to try to analyze the impacts? I'll run you through a couple examples here that we developed. So hypothetically, of course this is not happening, but if there were a proposed fare change to increase a single fare from $2.50 to $3, and monthly passes from $100 to $110, we would look at the amount of that increase and also the proportion of that type of fare payment by non-minority riders and by minority riders. In this example, this is completely hypothetical, but let's say that 80% of non-minority riders paid their fare by using a monthly pass. 20% paid with cash, as opposed to minority riders who 60% paid with a pass and 40% paid with cash. In essence, we have more minority riders paying with cash, and the cash fare increased more than the monthly pass did. So we would weigh this and look at the average increase for the average minority rider and the average non-minority rider, and weigh them. And if there is a difference, like in this case there is, a 14% average increase for minority riders as opposed to 12% for non, we would say that's a disparate impact. We need to address that with mitigations or change course. We also look at the system level of who's impacted in the entire system. So we would compare the entire non-minority population in the Trimet district and the minority population in the Trimet district and see who's impacted by a service change or a fare change. If the percentage impacted of the minority population is essentially greater by a certain degree, and the details are exciting for people like me to discuss, but not so much for most people. Essentially, if you weigh those and there's a greater percentage of impacted minorities, we would say that's a disparate impact, and again, we need to mitigate. So that's kind of an overview, and I'll turn it back to John L. to wrap things up.
Actually, you still have this component.
Oh, it still happens. All right.
Public participation.
Well, that's another important piece of our equity efforts. Our public participation is crucial to seeing how individual riders are affected and seeing disparate impacts or disproportionate burdens. Actually, and one thing I forgot to mention, we do this same analysis, this disparate impact analysis, comparing low-income and non-low-income populations. That's the disproportionate burden piece of things. Same process, but just looking at those populations instead of minority, non-minority. So, as you all know, we have a Transit Equity Advisory Committee that we look to guide us on recommendations, specifically with an equity lens. In this Title VI process, they helped us form really what our community forums would look like, give us feedback on what we thought we should present, and had them kind of look through that and say, is this understandable, what can change? And we took in their recommendations to make it a little bit more user-friendly, I suppose. Several members of the Transit Equity Advisory also facilitated at our community forums. We had small group discussions. And then, of course, they provide ongoing feedback on a variety of issues to help us inform our equity efforts. Here is a map of the community forum participants. We had them put a pin in where they came from. Not everyone actually put one in, so there's not as many as there were participants. But you can kind of see we got quite a few people from around the region and around the Trimet district. We held them in locations specifically to try to reach people, and we had one in each county, and tried to go to places where we thought people would be most likely to show up. So with that, now I will finally turn it back to Jonah.
Great, and you're still awake, so that's good. As Jake pointed out, throughout the process of developing our Title VI program as well as our policies, we engaged the community. We held 3 community forums, 1 in each county, with a total attendance of roughly about 76 participants. And of those attending, we asked them on the sign-in sheet, are you transit dependent or not? And of those who participated, 63% identified as being transit dependent. So that was our target audience in going out, and certainly we're pretty pleased with that. But we did hear a number of important things that are certainly worth noting for you today. The first is that Trimet should approach equity positively and proactively, that we should continue to think beyond Title VI. Again, Title VI is just our baseline in how we think about equity. That all service change are major to someone. All service change are major to an individual rider, and that we should continue to be mindful when making service and fare changes. And lastly, that Trimet should work to address transit affordability, specifically for low-income and people who can't access our services. By and large, folks thought that this board's adoption of mitigation program was a very important step in that process. Before you today is Resolution 131168, which essentially approves the policies as we described them today, and the system-wide service standards and our public engagement process. Once adopted, the plan will be submitted to FTA in compliance with our December 1st deadline. And with that, we'll take any of your questions.